Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar hosted by our San Mateo County Dental Society. My name is Brad Hart. I'm your 2021 Zoom president of San Mateo County Dental Society. Before we get started, I want to review how we'll be running this meeting. All participants will be placed on mute. Our presenter will provide a presentation on HR Bootcamp. During the presentation, you may post a question in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that during the meeting, and if we look at one that looks pretty, we may grab it. For those participants on a desktop, that Q&A box is located on the bottom of your screen. For those of you on an iPhone or iPad like myself, the Q&A box should be in the upper right. Feel free to post your questions, and time permits, we'll try to go over them at the end if we didn't answer it then. So now let's get started. Tonight's presenter is Michelle Corbo. She's one of the original practice support team members. Miss Corbo is a practice analyst that knows a thing or two about its resources. She contributes regularly to the CDA update, develops practice support resources for CDA website, and speaks to dentistry audiences across California with a focus on best employment practices. Ms. Corbo began her dentistry career as an assistant, quickly became an office manager, and now brings 18 years of private practice management experience, plus another 13 years supporting CDA members. Please welcome Michelle Corbo.
Oh, thank you. I believe I need to share my screen here. So let's get to here. Share it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I actually grew up in San Jose, not far from where you all are. I attended San Jose City College in the dental assisting program, but I really only spent about a year as an assistant. I've been with CDA actually 15 years. I've earned at my time at CDA several employment law certifications, a national certification, a California certification, and most recently a California employment law expert certification. So I might know a little bit about employment law. If I don't know the answer, I can generally find it. Let me change my slide here. You already know who I am. Just a quick disclaimer that I'm not an attorney. There's nothing in the presentation that should be interpreted or relied upon as legal advice. Consult a qualified attorney about any issues or concerns that you may have. If you do have specific situations that you need to discuss with an attorney, I do have some that I can refer you to that work with CDA and TDIC policyholders. So you can always reach out to me via email or phone if that works out. So we have a robust agenda. Makes sense since this is an employment law boot camp. I hope you'll gain a solid understanding of employment laws, and how to build a foundation of best practices to avoid common HR mistakes, gain confidence in operating a legally compliant office, and have the ability to enhance morale in the practice and create consistency with your team. Because we have so much ground to cover, I'll try to answer any questions you have during the presentation, but if we're running out of time, it may be better that you contact me after. I have, over the last week or so, been experiencing some connection issues. So if I drop, hang in there, I'll get back to you. So we're going to dive into hiring laws and best practices. When recruiting new employees, it's a difficult task, especially now. I know with robust unemployment benefits, it's been harder and harder. Even though even pre-COVID, it was harder and harder for you to find help. But hopefully you do have an opportunity when you have an opportunity to find candidates. You've got to be careful because hiring when done improperly, can easily create discrimination liability or jeopardize your at-will employment relationship. So first thing I recommend is you create a roadmap. Every position should have a current job description. Once you recognize you have a need to fill a position in your practice, even if you have a current job description, my recommendation is that you review it. Make sure that it still pertains to the position that you're hiring for, that it contains the essential job functions or the requirements for why the job exists. I don't recommend that you reuse old job descriptions. Maybe the position has evolved over time. The job description will support the determination of exempt or non-exempt status, which is what we'll get into in a bit. It can guide future performance evaluations. When you're providing your employees a job description, they know what their job is and what they're supposed to do, and what expectations are set, and those things that they need, those tasks that they need to meet, the qualifications that they need to meet. A job description can also assist with a reasonable accommodation request. When you have documentation of what the essential job functions of the position are, and you have an individual who's requesting an accommodation can't do the essential job functions, it may be possible that you can't accommodate, or maybe there's things in those essential job functions that can be modified in some way. So it's really important to have that documented, especially if you're working with the employee's healthcare provider in determining, this is what this job entails. Can this individual do these tasks? Possible they can, possible they can't. So it's really important to have that job description. In the last few years, I don't know how long it's been since you've had a presentation, but there has been some changes in salary histories. So you, when interviewing, are prohibited from directly asking about the history of compensation and benefits of the candidates that you are considering. You have to set the salaries for the position that you're hiring for. Again, that job description will help you with that. And you need to, have a salary range to determine what's the lowest, the mid, and the highest based on experience and the factors of the position. It doesn't preclude a candidate from voluntarily providing that information. But that's not something you can ask, and you really shouldn't use that when factoring what you will pay for a position. And you must provide a copy of a pay scale. So job description, pay scale, have something in writing that determines what you're willing to pay for this position. Again, low, medium, and high salary considerations. That can be provided after completing the initial interview, and that isn't something that you are required to provide for your current employees. I'm not sure how many of you do, but using an application is really, really important. A few reasons why is, first of all, I recommend that you use an up-to-date California-specific application. It's really, really easy to download applications, Google application. There are things that you cannot ask, again, salary, age, prior history inquiries related to any wages, gender, personal schedule. Better to ask about the specific schedule that you're hiring for. The most important is to ban the box. You're not allowed to ask for any criminal history prior to providing a written request, or a written job offer. So it's very important that you use an application that is California specific. Reason being is it provides a consistent format. You might have received a resume, but maybe you want additional information, and you're asking the same questions of each candidate. So that way you are gathering all the same information, and it's all consistent. You get to see a complete picture of the candidate or the applicant. Perhaps there's things that they haven't included. It allows you the ability to get signatures. One, that you will be checking references, so giving you permission to check references. The other is that, the verify the understanding of the position, and it is an opportunity to collect the signature for that they understand that employment is at will. And they certify that everything on that application is true. So that way, if it does turn out that something that they've provided you on their resume or whatnot, it turns out that it wasn't true, you may be able to either terminate or withdraw an offer of employment. So important to get those signatures. My recommendation when you are accepting resumes and application is add some simple instructions to follow. This is just kind of a tip, not something that you absolutely need to do, but require a cover letter. Ask for a sentence or two about why they'd like to work for you or what makes them the ideal employee. It'll give you an idea of their writing style. Not that dentistry requires a lot of writing. In some positions it does, but it gives you an idea of their writing style. And then again, require 3 personal references, names and contact information. And as I said at the bottom, hint, eliminate those applicants who don't follow directions, right? Easy tip. California does offer a guide for pre-employment inquiries. If you need some help and guidance with what to ask and what not to ask when hiring in those interviews, whether you do a pre-employment call, or pre-interview call or interview. So this is really, really helpful. Recommendations, we're often asked about where to recruit. You really want to open up the talent pool of viable candidates as much as possible by utilizing different sources. Recruiting is not about hiring the first person you've interviewed for the position. We call that warm body hiring. I know right now times are lean, so that might not be something that you can avoid. But you could use external postings. Indeed, local dental societies have the ability to post. I don't know if San Mateo does. CDA has a career center that you can list positions available. Internal referrals, obviously, patients that you really enjoy, that you think are great people. They probably know people who are looking for positions. Your employees, I always say birds of a feather flock together, and that you may have some great referrals, and even people that you can train that don't have any dental background. I'm seeing more and more social media. I belong to several of some Facebook groups here in Sacramento. And I constantly see members posting on there for positions available. And I see other dental professionals on there as well. So there may be some in your area to use, Facebook. Again, peer referrals, school inquiries, obviously staffing agencies, and then again, CDA.org. Part of hiring is marketing your practice. Pay as much attention to the marketing for the potential candidate as you do for marketing your practice. Your ad should be as much about selling your practice to potential candidates, so you get the greatest and the brightest when you're looking for the highest quality candidates. So it is a bit of a candidate-driven market. So there are multiple employment options and opportunities, and there's a war for talent. So what is that competitive advantage that you can put when marketing yourself, and something that can add some pizzazz for your ads. As far as the interview process, like I mentioned, consider pre-screening. You are busy practitioners. You know, do those phone interviews, gauge the candidate's level of self-awareness, compatibility, not just likability, you know, that you, you know, have the opportunity to ask questions about, you know, why they're interested, you know, what got them into dentistry. Are they personable on the phone? Do they seem distracted? Can you tell, you know, are they articulate? You know, you're really looking for those soft skills versus the technical skills, attitude, character, communication versus, you know, the academic, the training, the licensing, and the prior experience, right? So assessing those soft skills during that pre-screening will give you a really good idea of an individual. You know, can you tell, are they smiling, are they bubbly, or are they just, you know, really kind of flat and really not somebody that isn't really going to be compatible in your practice. Be sure and take notes. Ask consistent questions of each candidate that you do pre-screen. I recommend that you do that for all of the interview process, for sure. Interview best practices. Definitely ask about, you know, the fit, right? The interview questions don't necessarily violate the law in and of themselves. The problem that happens with asking the wrong kinds of questions is generally people are hardwired to be conversational. And what happens is you can inadvertently ask questions about family and kids and hobbies that could lead to information that you might reveal about protected classes. You know, you may find out that a candidate has 5 children, and you, in your mind, you're like, "Oh, that's going to be a lot of time off," right? We've got sick kids, or distance learning, or children's activities. They may say something about their hobbies that lead to religious affiliations. So you really want to keep the questions um, uh, about job history, training, experience, the ability to meet the needs of the schedule. Think about the purpose of each question you're asking related to your job description. Use your job descriptions to help you draft the questions. You know, you just want to be really, really careful. You know, if somebody has an interesting accent, and you know, you happen to ask about where they're from, you really, really need to be careful to just keep it specific to the job that you're hiring for. And again, don't ask about prior wages. Verify references. This is something that I find that about half of the members that I speak to, when they're calling me about an employee that they didn't check references on, and they learn after they've hired the individual that they really should have, because there were things that they should have known, and there were deficiencies and problems at a prior employer that they could have known. You absolutely are protected. You and the prior employer are protected when answering truthful information about a potential new hire. As long as the information is truthful, there is no possibility. Well, there's always the possibility, but there generally can't be a lawsuit, you know, claiming that you provided slanderous information. Again, as long as it was truthful. You can even, you're even protected from, I think I'm going to sneeze, I'm sorry, Sacramento allergies. You can even answer questions or provide information if an employee was let go for harassment. You are protected from providing that kind of information. So please verify references. They can always say no, that they don't provide references, but please do those checks and keep notes, and make sure that all your hiring processes that you have notes. Verify licenses. On several occasions, I've received calls from practice owners who just happened to check a license of an RDH that had been expired for 2 years, and he had no idea. So definitely verify licenses. Keep record and track that you are obtaining copies of renewed licenses. Don't lose track of that. It's very important that you provide an offer letter when hiring a candidate, especially if you'd want to do a background check. Your offer letter can, your background checks can only be performed once a conditional offer of employment has been provided. Background checks are not mandatory, but if you do decide to, definitely provide that offer letter and take your time. I always say hire for quality. Skill can be trained. It can be a painful process, but making a quick decision, choosing the wrong candidate, and then having to turn around and terminate is a hassle. It's a lot of time and energy taken through this process, money spent. It's painful. So definitely take your time, ask the right questions, and definitely check those references. Going to talk a little bit about working interviews. So the question is, who is an employee? Do you know who you're hiring? I know that working interviews are very, very common in dentistry. I got to tell you, I'm not a big fan. You do need to realize that if you have somebody coming in and working for you, they are an employee. You might consider them a candidate, but the state of California says if they are performing any work for you, they are employed, even for a day. I find that working interviews, while they can be helpful in determining skill, you can set up skills tests. Perhaps you have, during, it can even be during the workday. I would keep the time to a minimum, set up an operatory and ask them how they would set it up differently, what's missing, have them walk you through sterilization, have them do, a mock patient entered into the system, create a skills test as opposed to having it be a working interview. I find that working interviews are kind of like a first date. Everybody's on their best behavior, right? First date, everybody's on their best behavior. Everybody shows up on time. Everybody's bubbly. Everybody's good. It's really, week 3, week 4, week 5 is when you're going to find out who this individual is. Doctor, did you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. We did get a question. Is it okay to contact any prior employers listed on the resume? Or do you need these to specify to get permission from the candidate regarding which specific ones you can contact?
I would absolutely, because it is very possible that that candidate is still working. So they may want to limit who you reach out to, and I would obtain that acknowledgement that they give you permission. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yep, no problem. So please understand, working interviews, they are employed. You do need to pay them. There are no shortcuts. You have to collect all the required forms. You have to provide all the notices. You have to pay them at the end of the day. If it's a one-day assignment, that's by law. If they come in for a couple of days, you need to pay them by the end of the week. Yeah, I would just be really, really careful that you understand. Again, temporary employees, basically the same thing as a working interview. They need all the paperwork. You've got to pay them at the end of the day. And they are considered employees of the business unless you're hiring them through an agency. Interns and volunteers. I often get questions about interns and volunteers. And unless they're affiliated with a school, there's really no such thing as a volunteer or an intern. So they need to be affiliated by, with a school. That isn't something that you can just do on your own. So definitely consider them an employee, even paid at minimum wage for the time that they are in the business. So again, if you're going to have somebody come in and do a working interview, they're not considered a 1099 employee. Definitely got to pay them. Definitely collect all the paperwork. The other thing I wanted to mention is, as I was mentioning earlier, there's always the possibility of learning something about an individual, even inadvertently, of their protected class, that they're in a protected class. I recently had a call from an office who was performing working interviews. was actually a bit of an extended working interview. They had her in a quote unquote working interview for 2 weeks. Whether or not it was 2 weeks, whether or not it was 1 day, it didn't matter. The candidate revealed she was pregnant and they wondered what to do. I said, start planning the shower because she's employed. Because at this point, if you were to terminate because of that reason, or it appeared that you were terminating or not hiring because of that reason, big trouble would have ensued. So got to be really, really careful about that. All right, I beleaguered that. So let's go on. As I mentioned, reference checks, no specific law, employer protections, avoid negligent hiring claims. Again, check those references, because if there's the possibility that somebody has had some violent outbursts or some sort of issue with confrontations and something happens in your business, better that you've checked references, because if you should have known, there could, that could lead to issues if there are problems in your own business. Again, no prior salary history inquiries from candidates or prior employers. Definitely follow your policy. If you have a policy that you don't give references, definitely follow that policy. But check references if you are hiring. As I mentioned, use a written offer letter. A background check can only be performed after a conditional offer of employment. I would, in that offer letter, include pay, the schedule, and the start date. I warn about the start date a little bit because those background checks can take a little time. So while you could put a tentative start date in that offer letter, I've had members who have had an individual start prior to receiving the background check back, and then had to make some decisions after that person had already started about the criminal history coming back and having some things that weren't up and up. All candidates have to be screened equally. You can't cherry pick who you decide to do background checks with. It has to be a common practice for all candidates before hiring. There are steps, very specific steps to take if you need to take an adverse action, meaning withdrawing an offer of employment. The law requires that, yes, did somebody say something? The law requires, with a certain amount of days offered, that if you find something, you have to provide a copy of the background check to the individual. If you are going to withdraw the offer, you have to give the individual an opportunity to provide additional information that might give you an opportunity to see them in a different light and change their mind, or change your mind. So there's a series of steps back and forth between you and the candidate before you can ultimately withdraw that offer. So be really careful if you're going to use a reputable company. There are notice requirements. There are acknowledgement requirements. When hiring a reputable company, my recommendation is use one that has an online portal that you provide to the candidate, and that way they're working directly with entering their information online. You'll want to find one that has global information, private information protections and whatnot. So I do have some I can recommend if you do decide you're going to do background checks. The other thing is resist the urge to Google candidates. Background check companies don't generally do social media checks or bring back Google information. You just have to be really, really careful that you don't ask questions about things that you may have learned in a Google search or a Facebook search or an Instagram search. So I would just recommend that resist the urge. If you do, don't document it, don't say anything, because again, you could get yourself into some discriminatory trouble. So you're hired. There are 17 different forms that the state of California does require that you provide the employee to fill out. notice requirements, you know, various forms. We do have an employee onboarding checklist. Not only does it provide you steps to take in advance of an employee joining your practice. Again, don't lose employees due to poor planning. Set realistic training timelines. We do have links to the required forms as part of this checklist. And you've got to allow time during the first workday to get this done. I have had a number of members who have contacted me because they didn't collect very important information from the candidate. Neither, you know, it was a working interview day and they didn't get a the W-2 back, and they don't have, you know, a social, they don't have an address, or the employee worked for a day, didn't bring the paperwork back. You know, what do? I need to pay this individual. And there are steps you can do to get them their wages, but definitely allow time during the first workday. You can allow time in advance of the first workday if it works for you, but you just need to make sure you pay the individual for the time it takes to fill out that paperwork. So just make sure it's included in that first paycheck. So wage and hour violations are typically the most common types of violations employees will complain about, right? Meal and rest breaks, non-payment of overtime. These are the laws that employers should really develop best practices and have thorough documentation and consistent policies with, because they really are the easiest to get nabbed with employee complaints. So let's start with, you know, what are employee classifications, right? Wage order 4 includes all the information you need on how to pay your employees, how to provide proper meal and rest breaks, how to classify your employees, how to provide appropriate overtime. This wage order is included in the poster set. So it is hung in the office, easily viewed by your employees and easily read by you. I highly recommend you read it. It's super boring, but I've had to read it a couple times now because I actually am the one that goes through and updates the poster sets that CDA provides to you. So you've got to strictly follow all the rules of the wage order. So if you haven't ever read it, I highly recommend it. You know, take it bite-sized pieces because it is a lot of information and a lot of legalese, but I would definitely review it. Current minimum wage in California is $13 an hour, but follow the local minimum wage for requirements for your area. And if you have 26 or more employees, which doesn't generally happen a lot in dentistry, we don't have as many big practices, but I might be talking to members who do. So it's $14 an hour. Now, as I mentioned, local minimum wage ordinances are going bananas. So these are all the cities I am aware of as of today that have local minimum wage ordinances. So make sure that you are following your local minimum wage. I think right now they are following the consumer price index. So check your county's website or your city's website to determine what the local minimum wage is and make sure that you are in compliance. So let's talk a little bit about who is a non-exempt employee. Basically all of your employees. Excuse me just a sec. So state of California considers all employees to be non-exempt hourly employees, unless you can support them being considered a salaried employee. Minimum wage per hour, although there is a training wage that is, I believe it's 2/3 of minimum wage, California minimum wage, that can be paid during the first 160 hours, I believe it is, if you are doing some training. I didn't include that in here, so don't quote me, but I certainly, if you do have somebody that's joining your team who has untrained, you can pay a little bit less than minimum wage. And the minimum wage poster does indicate what that is. All hourly employees, as you know, are subject to overtime, meal and rest breaks. Compliance with paying non-exempt employees. Super important that you define what your work week is. Easily done in your employee manual. You've got to designate a work period for non-exempt employees. Again, you also need to define what your work day is, the 24 consecutive hours. It should be documented somewhere. And like I mentioned, that should be in your employee manual or part of your policies. Document the employees' hours that they're scheduled to work. That can easily be done in their offer letter. Follow the wage order for your industry. Pay for their hours that they actually work, not just scheduled hours. So if you, as the employer, are aware that an employee is working off hours, if you've got an office manager that's checking messages after hours or logging into the system after hours to work, if you have an employee that is coming in early to prep for the day or working late, definitely pay for the hours, not just scheduled hours work. And obviously calculate and compensate for overtime. The Fair Pay Act does indicate that employees need to be paid equal pay for substantially similar work. So if you have, you have the burden to justify your pay disparities. So if you have, RDAs, if you have RDHs that are paid different wages, you need to have a reason why, whether it's seniority, whether it's education, whether it is time in the industry, it's performance, whatever it is, you have the burden to justify the pay differences. Super important is when your employees come to you and say, why is this individual being paid more than I am, since we both work 2 days a week or we both do the same job, what gives? Because employees do have the ability to discuss their wages, hours, and working conditions. That cannot be something that an employer controls. They do have the ability to talk. Employees don't necessarily have to divulge what their wages are, but it doesn't keep other employees from asking. And I have had employers call who have had some issues with that. You definitely need to maintain your payroll records for 3 years with regard to how you're paying your individual employees. And if there are issues with employees not feeling as though you are paying them equally, there is something called a PHRca claim that can be filed, which in its simplest term is a class action. If you have an employee who feels that there are wage violations, that there's some sort of employment law violation, they can file a private attorney general act violation and sue on behalf of the rest of the employees. And these can be super expensive. So again, you want to be careful with PHRca claims. So be sure you're able to justify how you're paying your individual employees. So basic overtime requirements is still a bit confusing for some. Employees in California need to be paid based on California overtime law and federal overtime law. So California overtime law is over 8 hours in a workday. Federal law is 40 hours in a work week, or the first 8 hours worked on the seventh day of, worked on the seventh day of a work week. And that's, if you have an employee that works 4 days, it's under 40 hours, but one of those days they work 9 hours, they get paid 1 hour overtime. Again, if they work 5 days at 8 hours a day and they happen to come in for a couple hours on a Saturday to do some catch-up work, then the 40-hour rule applies and they're paid 2 hours for that time on the weekend. So just make sure you are calculating for both the weekly and the daily overtime. And then, as I mentioned, or as I listed here, double regular rate of pay for any days over 12 hours in a workday or 8 hours on the 7th day of work. One thing that I'm not sure employers are aware of is calculating for regular rate of pay. And this is an overtime calculation. So regular rate, that's a tongue twister, is not always an employee's normal hourly wage. It can include commissions. It can include production bonuses, piecework earnings. If you have an employee that's paid 2 rates of pay during the workday, maybe you have a hygienist that's paid, a certain amount when they're seeing patients versus maybe they're doing administrative work. You need to make sure that you are providing for both regular rates of pay when calculating overtime, if overtime should occur. So most payroll systems will calculate for regular rate of pay. It's definitely important to make sure that, any production bonuses, that doesn't include discretionary bonuses, which is an attaboy, right? You're doing a great job. You've been working really hard. It's been noticed. So, here's $100 bonus. That's not included. It's when there's an expectation that there's a certain number of units of toothbrushes that are sold and somebody gets 10% of that or something. So just make sure that you're calculating in for any overtime with that. Overtime management best practices. Get a lot of complaints about employees who are either trying to take advantage of overtime, or maybe somebody's just really visiting a lot with with the patients in the chair, and the work day is expanding and they're not really able to get their work done and clock out for the end of the day. Have a written policy defining the expectations and consequences, and you've got to be consistent. That policy should indicate that all overtime needs to be approved in advance. Although even if it does occur, you still need to pay it. But if you've got a policy that indicates that your expectations are that you be notified, you can discipline for that time. You're able to manage it, right? That way, if somebody comes and says, hey, we had X number of emergencies today and I wasn't able to get to this task and I'm going to do it now. And you can either say, nope, go home. It's okay. We'll do it in the morning. Or you're aware that the overtime is occurring. Maybe if you have overtime that's happening with a hygienist, you really need to look at what's going on. Is there too much chit chat? Is the chit chat productive though, right? Because we have to keep in mind that those individuals are creating bonds in the practice, and those patients come back because they love their hygienist and their dentist, right? So, maybe that overtime is really worth it because they're really taking that quality time to build those relationships. I know I build relationships with my hygienist. So, you've got to weigh if the overtime is worth it. There are no legally allowable waivers. An employee cannot waive their right to overtime unless we're talking about alternative work week, which we'll get to. Again, you need to regularly identify and discuss barriers to compliance. Maybe you have schedulers that aren't scheduling, patients well, so that way your employees aren't incurring that overtime. And try to avoid an overabundance of time card change requests, right? So, because that can appear that, if you've got a complaint that that an employee is not being provided the overtime that they are entitled to. Let's talk about hygienist wage traps. I find that employers like to complicate compensation. is probably the easiest way to say it, is I know that hygienists are still in some cases paid on a per patient rate, or what we would call a piece rate or a widget rate. Also a per diem rate. What you do need to understand is anybody who is paid on a per patient rate or a piece rate also needs to be paid for downtime. So if there is time in between patients that they are prepping for patients, they are getting the room ready, breaking down the room, taking their 10-minute breaks, their 2 10-minute breaks, which are paid breaks. If they are, pulling charts, whatever it is that's related to patient care, they need to be paid. You can pay it at a lower rate. It can be paid at minimum wage. And this is where that calculating for regular rate of pay comes in, right? You've got a hygienist who is has a per patient rate, and then you're paying, $15 an hour for any other time and break time. You've got to calculate for that regular rate of pay if overtime should occur. As far as a per diem rate, per diem employees, essentially, my understanding is I'm guaranteeing you X number of dollars per day, regardless of how many patients you see. This is not a salaried individual unless they meet the exemption requirements that we'll talk about in a bit. They're essentially an hourly employee. They need to be provided their appropriate 10-minute rest breaks, their 2 10-minute rest breaks. They need to be paid overtime. I find that practices get into the habit of what's the word I'm looking for? Essentially taking away from the per diem if the day should be cut short. You run the risk of not paying appropriately, at least minimum wage. If you're prorating, that's the word I was looking for. If you're prorating somebody's wages, which really kind of defeats the purpose of a per diem, right? The guarantee is you work, X number of hours during the day. It doesn't matter how many patients you see, that's what I'm going to pay you. But please, please, please calculate for overtime and understand that these individuals are hourly employees. There are wage statement requirements for piece rate employees. If you aren't already including it, you do need to provide the employee a written itemized wage statement that contains specific information about, how many pieces or how many widgets that individual is paid for. So make sure that you are providing for all of those requirements. Let's see. Split shift pay. This is something else that happens specifically with hygienists, or it really could be any of your employees. When you've got a day that falls apart, it happens, you've got a couple of cancellations in the morning or a couple in the afternoon, and you ask your employee to clock out early, and then have the employee come back, to complete the day. There could be a split shift penalty owed if a split shift should occur. So if your employee is asked to clock out at, let's say, 10:30 because the day fell apart, and goes to lunch early and then comes back at 1 o'clock and completes the day, that's more than an hour between shifts, and it doesn't include the lunch hour, right? It's beyond the lunch hour if it's longer than that. The split shift premium pay is 1 extra hour of wages should an employee be required to clock out early and come back. Now, no split shift premium, as I indicated here, is owed to the employee if they request time to leave early. You know what? I'm just going to go ahead and clock out. I'll, go off and go shopping or go home if they live nearby or whatnot, and I'll come back. So, or I need to run some errands or I have to pick up my kids or whatnot. So just be aware that if you're in control of asking an employee to clock out for longer than the lunch hour and it's more than an hour, you owe that premium pay of 1 hour's pay. You don't calculate for overtime should it go over 8 hours in the day. That's just the extra hour penalty. If you are paying a split shift penalty, I would recommend that you add that as a line item on your wage statement, because that way you can easily point to any penalties that you have paid out in case a third party should ever inquire as to whether or not you did pay that premium pay, that penalty. Time cards, they're legal documents. I am aware that there are some employers that have their employees write down on a piece of paper what their hours are, and they weren't hanging on to them. You know, they would just toss them after payday. So ultimately, you are responsible, not the employees, for maintaining those accuracy of those records. You need to make sure, again, that you are managing off the clock work. If you are aware of your employees doing off the clock work, this could be even an employee who clocks out, locks up, walks to the garbage can, is dumping trash, and if it's, 5 minutes worth of time, you need to make sure that you're compensating for that. Same when somebody comes in in the morning. If they're running through the office, turning on equipment, turning on lights, and then as the computer's warming up before they're able to clock in, and that's more than de minimis time, more than a little bit of time, that time adds up. And the state of California has made a determination that employees need to be paid for that off the clock work. So really pay attention to what your employees are doing before and after they clock out. Your employees should be signing their time cards to verify the accuracy of what was entered over the course of the payroll period. If you are using a rounding system, be careful when rounding. It is legal to round employees' time, either rounding up or rounding down, or I should say rounding up and rounding back. You need to make sure that it is not on its face more beneficial to the employer, that it really equals out whether, the rounding up and the rounding down, so that you're not taking away from the employee more often than you are providing. Audit your systems often. Make sure, again, that your rounding systems are accurate. You want to avoid any inaccuracies. Your handbook should really communicate to your employees the consequences of not keeping good timekeeping. Oh, I forgot. What am I going to do? Ultimately, you can terminate an employee for violating your timekeeping policy. So if you have somebody that's been loosey-goosey about clocking in and it's creating a documentation issue for you, I would make sure you're consistent with all your employees in letting them know how important the timekeeping policies are. You could be called to the carpet at some point to verify that your employees were being paid overtime, or that they were clocking at it appropriately, or that your rounding system is equal on both sides. So make sure that you are defining those, that employees are immediately notifying you when there are errors. Let's talk a little bit about alternative work weeks. Very common in dental practices. I worked an alternative work week and I really miss those Fridays off. So an alternative work week is the only time an employee has the ability to waive their right to overtime. It is not established by the employer on a whim, as I mentioned. I've had some employers just say, oh yeah, we work an alternative work week. That's what I've always done. And they never had an employee's vote, right? So there are very specific steps prior to implementation. And you've got to provide the employees a notification of what the schedule is going to be, the extended schedule, right? An alternative work week, if you don't know, is an employee's ability to work over 8 hours without being paid overtime. There needs to be a secret ballot vote. You need to provide the notice to employees 2 weeks prior to implementation if it passes by 2/3 vote. It must be registered by the state of California. If it is not, it doesn't exist. Should there ever be a complaint about non-payment of overtime, they will check to see if you have an alternative work week. Once you've registered it with the state, it's easy on the Department of Industrial Relations website to look it up. I often look it up if I have a member who calls while I'm on the phone talking to them about, various overtime issues or their alternative work week. I'll look it up. There have been cases when I have not found it. Unless it's repealed by you, it will exist and it should be on that list. One thing to avoid are short shifts. It is very possible for a schedule to slip. Let's say you implemented an alternative work week 10 years ago. Over time, you've decided that you don't want to work that hard. You're not working the longer hours. What happens is your employees are now only being provided an 8-hour day, but you're not paying overtime because maybe they're working 8.5 hours, 8 hours and 15 minutes, but we're on an alternative work week, so we don't pay overtime. Well, if an employer isn't providing the alternative work week schedule and you're short shifting your employees, you owe them overtime. So be really, really careful. Either pay for the full 9 hours or repeal if it's not working for your practice. Repeal the schedule and no longer work an alternative work week. I can tell you that the Labor Commissioner isn't a big fan of alternative work weeks. You've got to be consistent with your schedule. You've got to be consistent with your documentation. I know of many large employers who have avoided entering into alternative work weeks because of the risks involved with short shifts and non-payment of overtime and mismanagement of schedules. So be really, really careful. If you do have an alternative work week, just go into the state of California's Department of Industrial Relations website, make sure it's listed. If it's not, get it listed. We have templates. We have all the information you need on the Practice Support website to implement this. So definitely make sure that you're checking it out. Pay for travel, meetings, and education. Required versus optional. So definitely make sure that you are paying your employees for where was I going with this? Oh, required. So required versus optional meetings. If you're having a meeting, a lunch and learn meeting during lunch hour, and you're bringing in some awesome food, you need to manage your meal break requirements. Your employees need to be provided a 30-minute meal break, uninterrupted meal break. We're going to jump into meal breaks soon. So make sure that your employees are being paid during those lunch and learn meetings. Required courses or optional courses. Now, a required course, I know that there are required courses for licensure. If you are requiring an employee to attend a specific course, then you would need to pay the employee for the travel time to the course that is beyond their commute time and time when they're in the course. Optional courses, an employee wants to attend a course for licensure, and it's whatever course they want, you're not required to pay for it. If you happen to throw an ad to your team and say, hey, these courses look really great, you guys want to check them out, and if it's just optional that they attend, even if you want to pay for it, you wouldn't necessarily have to pay for their time in the chair. You've got to be really careful about that. Again, education, wages, and making sure that you are that you're paying the commute time. If you, let's say, sadly, we're not doing it, but if you were going to send your team to CDA Presents Anaheim and it was required that they go, it's required that they attend certain courses, you've got to pay travel time. That's to and from the airport, to, travel time in the air, travel time to their hotel until they're released to go about, the rest of their day, but then also while they're in classes. So you've got to make sure that you're paying for the travel time. And I have no, reporting time pay. So reporting time pay. So I often get this question, I sent my employee home and they're insisting that they owe me, I owe them for the day. Or, I called my employee on Tuesday night that the day Wednesday fell apart and I'm being told that I owe them wages. Not necessarily. So reporting time pay is owed to an hourly employee if an employee reports to work and no work is available. You would need to pay the employee for half of the scheduled workday. So if an employee is expecting to work an 8-hour day and you send them home after 3 hours, you do owe for 4 hours. If it's a 6-hour day, it's 3 hours. It's really no less than 2 hours. If you call the employee the day before and the day has fallen apart and the employee does not show up to work, you do not necessarily owe an hourly employee, or you don't owe an hourly employee for the day. There's no guaranteed wages. There are exceptions. Employees paid on a standby status. You've got to be careful. If you have somebody that is standing by, then you do need to pay them, right? If they have to stand by, and you're requiring that they don't travel a certain distance, they have to call in. I don't know that happens very often in dental offices. So stand by, on call, make sure if you are in control of their time or their whereabouts, make sure that you're paying them for that time. When operations can't begin due to threats or when recommended by civil authority, which, crazy enough has been happening, right? Riots in the area and your employees can't get to work, or there's been some destruction in the area. When public utilities go out, water, gas, or electricity, you don't owe reporting time pay. An act of God interrupts work, right? Earthquakes, fires. It's crazy that, this is something that's actually been happening. And I actually included a policy in the employee manual this time around that is related to reporting time pay, so employees understand when they are owed money for non-work days. All right, compliance with meal and rest breaks. So COVID has really changed the world a lot in crazy ways, and we're finding that employers or employees are kind of relaxing their standards around meals and rest breaks. It's more difficult for employees to don and doff their PPE. So they're finding, they want to take off a mask and they're not allowed to eat in the break room. And it's just too much of a hassle. So employees aren't taking their breaks, or they're not taking their lunches, or there's just, craziness going on. It's really, really important. Unfortunately, employment laws haven't caught up necessarily with COVID, and managing COVID in managing employees in a pandemic. I was often found trying to fit a square peg in a round hole over the course of the last year, trying to manage employee issues in employment laws, right? Unusual employee issues in these employment laws. So you've got to make sure that you're either allowing additional time for your employees to take these breaks, but definitely going to need to. This is a non-compliance with meal and rest breaks is an easy win for an employee who is looking to bring a suit or a complaint against an employer. So definitely, it's easy for employers to comply, but you've got to comply and you've got to hold employees responsible. You've got to have a written policy about that employees must take their rest breaks, that you encourage rest breaks. A 10-minute is earned, and it's a 10 net minute, right? So if you happen to have a large building, your employees need time to get to the rest break area and time to get back. So maybe it's a little longer than 10 minutes, right? So they definitely need that time. Maybe again, donning and doffing of the PPE is taking longer. So maybe you actually need to give more like 15 or 20-minute breaks to allow them time to relax and rest. Whatever's working in your business. Maybe they aren't able to use the break room because of COVID and social distancing. So they have to leave the premises and, head outside. The rest break must be duty-free and uninterrupted. So employees must leave, or they should be encouraged to leave the work area. So there is no chance that they'll be interrupted. An employee cannot be prevented from leaving the premises. That used to be the law that you could prevent, but recent, or I should say, they're not that recent, but time seems to be flying. But a few years ago, there was a lawsuit that allowed an employee uninterrupted time, and they could be free to leave the premises. So you can allow an employee to leave the premises. You can discipline an employee who comes back late. Now, if an employee should be prevented from taking a rest break, not that they chose not to take a rest break, because it's important that they take them and they self-police police themselves and take the break and take it upon themselves. 1 hour premium is owed if a rest break is not provided. So super important that your employees are taking it and that they're not prevented from taking it. And that's 2 10-minute rest break, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. Mid-morning, mid-afternoon, doesn't have to be an exact time. Employees must be provided a meal break. It needs to be earned. It's earned if they work more than 5 hours in a day. It needs to be provided before the employee has completed 5 hours of work. That timing is super important. That law went into effect. I actually did that research with Ariel today in 2012. There was a case that provided for the uninterrupted, duty-free 30-minute meal break, and the timing must be completed within before the employee has completed 5 hours of work. So make sure that when your employees are clocking in, that they're calculating that they're taking that and clocking out for that meal break before the completion of the fifth hour of work. Employees must be allowed to leave the premises. A second meal break is earned more than 10 hours of work. Doesn't happen that often in this business, but you never know. You must keep accurate records of this. And again, there is a penalty. If an employee is prevented from taking a meal break, they need to be paid that 1 hour penalty premium, up to 2 per day. So it could be 2 hours if there's a missed rest break or a missed meal break. Do you have a question, Dr. Hart?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to wait till you finished.
That's okay.
We got a question from somebody who says, when does an employee clock in and clock out? Is it before or after wearing or taking I think off the PPE uniform, or 2, putting makeup on, going to the restroom or start of the day or end of the day?
Yeah. It would be, okay, so an employee should be clocking in. Well, an employee who's doing personal things, makeup, restroom, maybe grabbing coffee. There's that kind of skirts the line a little bit. But if they're doing personal things, they should be clocking in after they've put on their makeup, after they've fluffed their hair or whatnot. They should be clocking in when they are donning their PPE. They should be clocked in when they're taking their PPE off. So I think it'll be up to the employer to determine what's truly going on before and after the employees are clocking in. If it appears there's a lot of personal things happening, have a conversation with the employee about what is appropriate to do after clocking in. So that's really, that's a management issue. So meal breaks, let's get back to this. I provided kind of a guide here. So the important thing to know is if your workday ends in 6 hours or less, not 6:05, not 6:15, if you know that your workday is truly going to end in 6 hours or less, your employee can waive their right to a break, the meal break, not a rest break, but a meal break. I would recommend getting something in writing if this is a typical day. If there is one of your work days, the law is silent about whether or not an employee should sign a waiver every time. It's really up to the employer to make sure that there is a waiver on file. I would recommend if it's, maybe revisiting that waiver once a year to make sure that it is still by mutual agreement that that meal break is waived, because it is by mutual agreement. Maybe have them initial it once a year during their performance review, or, some sort of chart, personnel record review. So make sure you've got those waivers on file. We do have a sample one on the website. I talked a little, back up a little bit. I talked a little earlier about rounding. There was a recent case about rounding meal periods. If you do have time clocks that are rounding, do not round your meal periods. Reason being is if you are rounding your meal periods, you are not showing an accurate timekeeping record of employees' full meal period and could be avoiding paying those penalties. Your timekeeping records need to accurately show that your employees are taking their meal breaks on time, right before the 5th hour, and that they are getting a full and complete 30 minutes. So please audit your timekeeping companies or your systems to make sure you are not rounding those those meal breaks. Just quick to go through these meal and rest break responsibilities. Inform your team that you allow them, you encourage them, you want your employees to take their breaks. Train your management to ensure that they are not scheduling patients through times when employees should be taking breaks. Maintain consistency and discipline employees who aren't taking them. Super easy to get in trouble with meal and rest break laws if you're not making sure that your employees are taking them. Employees are responsible for self-managing their breaks. They do need to take responsibility of taking them. They also need to take responsibility of informing you when they are being prevented from taking a break. Because again, you owe that penalty if they're not able to. There's been an emergency patient put in the schedule. There's no way I can take my 10 minutes, right? So make sure that everybody's on the same page and that that is a consideration in your schedule. It's a team effort. They should be tag teaming to make sure everybody, the RDH, the RDA, the DAs, the front office, everybody's getting a break. You cannot combine breaks by law. You can't combine your 2 10-minute breaks with a longer lunch to create a longer lunch, or, to leave 20 minutes early at the end of the day. And again, that they are notifying the employer when they're prevented from taking a break. And premium pay we talked about. I know this is supposed to end at 8, so I've got a lot of material, but let's talk a little bit about exempt employees, and I may start to skip through some of these slides a little bit. So an exempt employee is specified in the wage order, and this is somebody who is paid on a salary basis. Super important that a job title alone does not substantiate an exemption. It is based on their duties. Are they doing substantially different work 51% of the time differently than other employees of the business? This isn't a glorified office manager or a receptionist that's really simply just taking calls and charting and checking benefits. This is somebody who's pulled away from those basic duties, and maybe they are helping with business of run the practice. Maybe they are processing payroll. They're managing the team. They actually have hiring and firing abilities. Just make sure your job descriptions clearly show that they are doing those duties. They meet the minimum salary requirement of being paid at least 2 times minimum wage per hour? That's regardless if they work 1 hour in the week or 40 hours in the week. They need to meet that minimum salary requirement of 2 times California state minimum wage, not your local minimum wage. Now, an associate in the practice can be considered can be covered under a professional exemption because of their licensure. It doesn't include hygienists, though. Hygienists need to have completed 4 years of an academic, pre-professional, accredited college through an ADA program, unless that individual is maybe managing a team of hygienists or doing work that is exceptionally different at least 51% of the time. So you've got to be really, really careful how you're classifying your employees. That per diem, again, is not considered a salary. Also keep in mind when hiring an associate, if you have an associate that's working in your business 1 day a week, that individual has to meet that salary requirement of at least 2 times minimum wage per month, and per year. So if you're paying somebody on a percentage of production or collections and they don't have a base rate, or they have a really slow month, you've got to make sure that they're meeting those wage requirements of at least making at least $1,040 per week. Or if you're a smaller employer of less than 25, if it's more than 25, then it's at least $1,120 per week. So make absolutely sure that you are meeting those salaried limits. If not, make sure you're paying at least a base rate. Pay requirements. So again, job duties clearly support the exemption. There are limited deductions from wages. Your employees who are considered exempt, if they only work 8 hours in the week and they did perform any work during that week, they need to be paid their full salary. For lack of work, for quality of work, there are very limited deductions. If your employee takes part of a day off and it's personal time, you can deduct from their PTO balance or their paid sick leave balance. But honestly, if they don't have those times available to them, you still can't deduct their wages. And I'll get into that in the next screen. Are you auditing your wage statements? Really, really important. There are very specific things that need to be on your wage statement. Gross wages earned, total hours worked. It's all listed in that wage order. This is another reason why an employee can bring a PHRca claim against you. If there is one little missing component to a wage statement, it could be that you don't have a complete address. It can be something missing like paid sick leave requirements. You're required to include paid sick leave as a line item on your wage statement. Let's say you terminate an employee and they complain to somebody, the labor commissioner or an attorney, about a wrongful termination. And it really turns out that they don't have a case because they were a terrible employee anyway, right? First question is they're going to ask, let's see your wage statement. Because they can easily bring a suit against a wage statement violation. There could be meal and rest break violations, any number of these, what they call low-hanging fruit, which is why I had the orange tree here. These are really easy things to get nabbed for, and they can equal thousands of dollars. So be really careful, do an audit. Your payroll companies are not responsible for your wage statements. I've had many employers call me when employees were earning more paid sick leave than they should have been because the caps weren't included. And unfortunately, you can't take the time away, and the payroll company isn't responsible. So your employee earned more than they were entitled to. So be really careful with that. Again, unlawful payroll deductions, quality of work, lack of work, disciplinary actions. That's from exempt employees' salaries. Non-exempt employee wages, I would be very careful about any loans, even with a written agreement. Not a good idea. Have the employee pay you if you have been somebody who has provided somebody a loan. Please be careful about that. You cannot withdraw money for property damage if it wasn't something that happened egregious, like they didn't, they threw something through a window. If it's just, the cost of doing business, lost paycheck fees, unreturned items, office keys, loss of, uniforms, things like that, you really can't deduct that from your employee's wages. Lawful payroll deductions, tax deductions, garnishments, employee benefits. That's pretty easy. Independent contractors. Are associate dentists independent contractors? Yes and no. It's really going to depend. The Borello test, so there was, AB5 that passed, and the Borello test is what's in place for associate dentists. You need to look at what is called the Borello test. There is really no one size fits all when it comes to independent contractors. I'll be honest, very rarely does an associate really qualify as an independent contractor, because you're generally providing them the office, you're providing them the instrumentation. It's even difficult when they are considered a corporation now to consider them an independent contractor. So you really have to work with an employment law attorney to determine what factors that each relationship encompasses when considering whether an associate is an independent contractor in your business. Everyone else other than associate dentists are considered under the ABC test. So like I mentioned earlier, temporary employees, hygienists, and any other types of employees, you need to look at, is the worker free from control and direction? Really hard to prove that you aren't controlling the work of everybody else in the business. The worker performs work outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. You can't. They're all doing dentistry in a dental office. And the worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade or occupation. Very rarely do they own another business where they have hung a shingle and they're doing dentistry elsewhere. So be really careful to evaluate the level of control that you have over the associate's work, how integrated the associate's work is into the financial well-being of the business. How the type of relationship, without a set date of termination, and you're offering benefits and vacation and a pension and it's gone longer than a year, it's really hard to prove that this isn't an employee of your business. Some best practices are have a written agreement, right? Establish compensation, require them to carry liability, to be responsible for their licensure. Don't provide tools, don't provide training, don't have crossover of employees of the business, require regular invoices, and don't set their hours. If you truly feel that an associate must be classified as an independent contractor, work with an employment law attorney to make sure you're covering your basis with that one. The penalties for non-compliance and misclassification and non-payment of overtime and potential trouble with the IRS, with the EDD, and everybody wants their money, and you've got workers' compensation issues. It can mean an expensive mistake. So make sure that you are evaluating each person independently. So let's talk a little bit about protected leaves. Vacation and PTO, obviously optional. It must accrue as an employee works, so they earn as they work. You can't have a use it or lose it policy. Keep in mind too that an employee who begins work for you and maybe isn't eligible for vacation until after the first year of employment is technically accruing time. So if an employee should leave your employment within the first year, technically they need to be paid out for any time that they earned while they worked during that first year and were unable to use that time. That is something that the Labor Commissioner does receive complaints about, is unpaid paid sick leave. So be really careful to pay out any accrued vacation that maybe somebody has earned during that first year. You can cap vacation time 1.5 to 2 times the amount. Again, you can increase the cap as employee earns more time. I talked about it earlier. You can deduct from an exempt employee's partial day. If they don't have available time, the employee is paid the full day. So it's really important to classify salaried employees appropriately because these deductions can be limiting. Paid sick leave still continues to be a major topic. Even though this law went into effect in 2014, it applies to all employees who meet the eligibility requirements, meaning they need to work for you at least 30 days. So if you know an employee is going to work for you for at least 30 days, they're eligible. They don't have to exceed that 30 days unless it's maybe a temporary employee. You must by law have a written policy, whether it's contained in an employee manual or not, it doesn't matter. State of California is up to 24 hours with a 48-hour overall cap. You get to determine what the 12 months are. The state doesn't care as long as it's 12 months. You get to provide whether it's based on accrual or front-loaded time. If you base it on accrual, the amount needs to roll over. If it's based on a front load, it's a gift of time. You can indicate at the end of the year the time is lost. You are allowed a 90-day probationary period before an employee is able to use the time that they began earning from the first day of work. If you are on an alternative work week where you have extended days, make sure that your full day and that the allowable time, instead of 24 hours, if you work, 4 9-hour days, you need to make sure you're providing a 27-hour cap per year to equal the amount of what your full day of work is. So make sure you're providing for that. Managing paid sick leave. Again, alternative work week schedule, require a healthcare provider's note. You can't unless it's exceeded the amount of time. It can be, can it be used as a personal or vacation day? It's really up to you, but know that you're setting a precedent if you do. You do not pay out paid sick leave at termination. You absolutely have to make sure that there is a line item on your employee's wage statement indicating the amount of time that they have earned. And you've got to maintain records for at least 3 years. I did include that there are paid sick leave. None of the ordinances are exactly the same. So check your local city and county if you happen to be in one of these cities or counties to make sure you're following the requirements. Pregnancy disability leave. So we're butting up against 8 o'clock here. Am I okay to continue or do you want me to stop? Where are we at? This is a boot camp. It's a lot.
I think just go ahead and go. Keep going.
You got it.
We did get one question.
Okay.
Let me go back to it. Not sure I understand it. You mentioned you cannot implement use it or lose it for paid time off. However, can you require your employees to use their PTO to avoid having to pay them double?
Well, so I don't know how you would pay them double, but
I did not quite understand it myself. So
yeah. So yes, you can require that they take that time off. If you happen to take vacations during the year, you can require that they use that time. Absolutely. So as far as PTO, or you can pay it out, right? You can pay it out at the end of the year if you don't want them to accrue over the course of time. I hope I answered that right.
You did. She just the questioner just said yes. You answered it.
Okay,
thanks.
Great. Yeah.
Great.
Pregnancy disability leave. So employers of 5 or more employees are required to provide pregnancy disability leave of up to 4 months That amount of time is determined not by the employee, but by the healthcare provider. We recommend, even if an employer has less than 5 employees, that they provide pregnancy disability leave, as they would really with any other disability leave accommodation. You should provide, or an employee should be required, or you can request an employee provide you a note from their healthcare provider of the need for leave. And it should include the dates of when leave will begin and when approximately the date when the employee will return. Get those doctor's notes. I find that members are very casual about providing leave of absence. And now more than ever it's very, very important that employees and employers are on the same page about leaves of absence. And I'll explain why in a moment. Group health benefits have to remain in effect. If an employee pays a portion of their premium, you can make arrangements to have them continue to pay the portion of their in some fashion, whether it's a check, cash, Venmo. It can be taken out of any, paid sick leave or PTO policies that, payout that they're using. It can also be paid after they return. Maybe they make up the difference later. Paid sick leave or vacation or PTUs policies should include whether or not employee must use the vacation or PTO prior to the onset of leave. Generally, I'm trying to remember here, I think paid sick leave is at the employee's discretion, but vacation can be at the employer's discretion. I might have that mixed up, but I'm getting tired. This is not baby bonding time. So keep in mind, this is just the time that the employee is disabled by pregnancy. Once the baby is born, and then an employee is released for pregnancy disability, we'll talk about, leave beyond pregnancy disability. Employees must be returned to their position. It must be the same position, the same pay, the same schedule. Transgender individuals are expressly protected. Leave can be taken continuously or on an intermittent basis. So maybe you have an employee who is experiencing some severe morning sickness and, is coming in late periodically prior to the onset of leave. That's all part of that 4 months. Or maybe, they need to take time off for doctor's appointments, or maybe there's a bit of bed rest or things here and there. So keep in mind that time is all cumulative before and after the leave. Reasonable accommodation. If you have an employee that is struggling with a rough pregnancy, it may be that they need to take time off beyond the 4 months, and that would be a reasonable accommodation of a leave of absence. Support healthcare provider's note, determining that this individual needs to take a longer amount of time off. It's a disability in California when you're pregnant. So really not a way around that. Return to work obligations. As I mentioned, you must return your employee back to the same position. A lot of times I find that performance enters into the conversation on whether or not they want an employee to return. Performance and leave of absence conversations should never enter into the same conversation. They shouldn't be even in the same universe. Not saying that it's impossible to terminate an employee who's been on leave. If you found, I found that I got a number of calls from employers who discovered some embezzlement, right? Everybody went on lockdown and employees weren't in the office, and then all of a sudden they were finding things. You find that there's being mistakes made. Unless it's, super egregious and you really have grounds to terminate, just because the temp in the office is better than the person that you had hired that was working in that position, you really should be bringing this employee back, have a conversation, set expectations, manage leave. There's really no magic timeline of when you could potentially let an employee go after returning from leave. There really isn't. And you don't want to be an employer that papers somebody's, personnel record post return from a leave of absence to show that suddenly they had this slew of performance issues. So be really, really careful about return to work obligations and performance, and really just understand when you provide somebody this leave of absence that you're guaranteeing them their job back. Talk to an attorney if you, for any reason, really need to let this person go. The reason why it is no longer a possibility really to be casual about leaves of absence any longer is California Family Rights Act, which has been in effect for many, many years, that used to apply to employers of 50 or more, now applies to employers of 5. So this provides eligible employees to take 12 weeks of protected leave, unpaid leave, to care for themselves or a family member. This also is related to baby bonding. You have a question?
Yeah. I always feel like I'm interrupting.
It's
I
okay.
apologize.
It's okay.
No, I feel like I catch you in the middle of a sentence.
It's okay.
I was hoping you'd finish your sentence always. That was my hope. It says, a hygienist gets paid a flat day rate, and the normal work week is Tuesday through Friday. Are they entitled holiday pay if there's a holiday that falls on Monday and we are required to pay?
It depends on your policy. Your holiday policies, one, should include who is eligible for holidays. Are your hygienists qualified for holidays? Do they work the hours? Are they not excluded as a whole? Your policy should also indicate that if a holiday should fall on a particular work day, whether or not employees will be paid if it's observed, or if it doesn't fall on a work day, if it is observed on another day. Your policy is going to dictate. Holidays are totally optional. Employers are not obligated to provide any holidays at all. So if you want to work on Christmas, you might not be the most popular employer on the street, but you can work, and there are no restrictions from that. So I hope I answered that question. It's really up to you, and it's really up to your policy. So baby bonding. So this is where it becomes really, really important for you to know when your employee is coming back from pregnancy disability leave, because should your employee qualify on your Family Rights Act, meaning they've worked for you for 12 months, doesn't have to be a consistent 12 months, and they've worked at least 1,250 hours. They have to qualify for both. They are qualified for California Family Rights Act. Baby bonding time. So it'll be important to know when the employee is being released from pregnancy disability leave so that you can designate when their 12 weeks begins. So your employee doesn't enjoy some sort of additional time off that they weren't necessarily entitled to because you didn't know when they were going to be released. So super important to be on the same page. Super important to get that documentation, and really, really important to communicate with your employees about all these leaves and comings and goings and get it documented. Employees also need to have employers need to maintain their benefits while they're on California Family Rights Act leave. So the five employees is super important when it comes to this. Are you a covered employer? There are some employers in dentistry that obviously have very small practices. And maybe right now there's only 4 employees, right? You've got a hygienist, you've got an RDA, and you've got, a front office and yourself, right? And that's 4. But the way you calculate the leave for California Family Rights Act is if an employer met 5 employees during 20 work weeks prior to the time when the employee needed the leave, it is very, very possible that you qualify as an employer of 5 or more. So I tried to do a little graph here that if you've got in 2019 a portion of the year where you had at least 5, and then you drop down to 4 for a good 15 months, you're still a covered employer until you have 20 work weeks. Yeah, 20 work weeks with 4 employees. So you're under 5. So most of the time you're going to be qualified unless you truly, truly have. And this can include temporary employees. So keep in mind, anybody who does a working interview as an employee, So those levels of employees can change and fluctuate over time. So really important to understand when you are a covered employer. I already mentioned the 12 months of service, not necessarily consecutive, works at least 1,250 hours. So let's talk about the reasons why. Other than baby bonding, this is an illness, injury, or impairment that requires inpatient care or treatment. It's not necessarily a disability. It could potentially be, cosmetic surgery. As you have certification and a determination by a healthcare provider that this individual needs this time, very difficult for you to deny it unless they clearly don't have the documentation or they don't meet the qualifications. Super important that you are providing accurate documentation. You have to provide them written documentation. They have to provide you written documentation of the determination by a healthcare provider within 15 days. Within 5 days of them providing you that information, you have to provide them with a determination of whether or not you are denying the leave. So that's very document heavy, very timing specific. This serious health condition could also be a determined family member's health condition. Again, obtain a note from a healthcare provider. So there could be a child, a spouse, a significant other. It could be, a domestic partner. It could be a grandparent, a sister, a brother. They've really expanded the definition of family members. So make sure you're getting the documentation of when an employee is requesting this for a leave of absence. They don't necessarily have to say, I need California Family Rights Act leave. If you become aware that an employee either verbally or in writing or, in conversation is like, yeah, I'm going to have some treatment on this, that, and the other, or I need to take care of my mom because she's going, through some cancer treatment. That's your trigger. That's your trigger to determine if an employee is eligible for the leave of absence. Purely staying silent is not something that you can do. You actually need to then provide information to your employee about whether or not they are eligible for a particular leave of absence. So it's up to you to provide the information to the employee. You can't be quiet about it and hope it's going to go away. Really important, calculating 12-month leave of absence. This is where it gets sticky, right? It can be a calendar year. It can be, measured forward from the employee's date the first leave begins. It can be, a fixed 12-month, a rolling period. I'll be honest, the rolling period is really the best, or the measured forward from the date the employee's first leave begins, because let's say you have a calendar year determined in your policy and the employee takes 12 weeks off at the end of the year. Well, once January hits and they need an additional 12 weeks off and they still qualify, then you're talking the employee's out for a potential, 24 weeks, right? So really you want to look at measuring either forward or do a rolling period measured backward from any date the employee used in any family leave. This leave of absence can also be designated if you have an employee who has an injury, even a workplace injury. If your employee has requested a leave of absence or needs a leave of absence because of an injury, even one that happened at work, you can designate it as California Family Rights Act leave of absence if you've got a doctor's note that indicates they need the leave. There's really no such thing as workers' compensation leave. It's a leave as an accommodation because of an injury. That's based on a reasonable accommodation. Now that CFRA leave has entered the picture, my recommendation is you determine and start counting it as California Family Rights Act leave. If you don't designate the time and then they request California Family Rights Act leave, that could mean an additional 12 weeks off if you didn't designate it and document it. So super important to know. Personal leaves of absence. Your employee either doesn't qualify for CFRA, they don't qualify, they don't have a disability, they just need time off for cosmetic procedure, they need time off for an extended vacation, whatever it is, you can provide on a case-by-case determination, as long as there isn't some sort of disability or some other, maybe your employee has only worked for you for 8 months and she doesn't qualify for baby bonding leave. And there's a desire to bond with the baby for longer. That's the type of personal leave that you can provide. As I mentioned, recognize employees' need for leave, even when they don't ask for it specifically. Know your policies, request appropriate documentation, follow the timing requirements, track the leave. California Family Rights Leave can be taken on an intermittent basis, meaning if somebody is going through some sort of treatment that requires them to take 2 hours off twice a week, that will count against that 12 weeks. So you've got to track it, find a way to track it. I know that HR for Health offers a tracking system, our endorsed services provider. So you need to track the start and end of the leave and the return date. So please, please, please don't be casual and cavalier about managing your leaves of absences now. Other types of leaves, there are a number of leaves that apply depending on the number of employees in your business. So please be aware of what they are. Real quick, state disability insurance is what pays your employees when they have a need for leave of absence, like pregnancy disability leave is covered by state disability insurance. Paid family leave, I think I might sneeze. Sorry. Paid family leave is a partial wage replacement benefit, not a right of leave. It's a terrible name for this wage replacement. It's a maximum of 8 weeks. It can be taken when employees on leave to care for them, a baby bonding time, care for a parent, care for or time off during a qualifying military exigency. There's no waiting period for paid family leave. So just understand the difference. When an employee says, I need to take time off for paid family leave, that's not a right of leave. So employee manuals, I'll kind of breeze through this. I hope you know that employee manuals are super important. It can make or break you. Your policies can make or break you. Third-party investigation, one of the first questions they'll ask for is, do you have a manual? Do you have policies? Can we see them? A manual itself is not a requirement of law, but written policies are. So what better place to put them than a manual? It should be a welcome. It should have practice philosophies, but super important. It's not a promise of continued employment. So your at will is reiterated. It defines who the policies apply to. There's a right to revise statement. You always have the ability to revise policies if they don't work for your business any longer, as long as they are not required by law. But your holidays, your PTO, maybe you want to change the way you're providing paid sick leave rather than front load. You want to base it on accrual, things like that. Introductory period. I often get questions from employers who email me or they call me and they say, this employee, it's just not working out and I'm going to go ahead and terminate. They're within that 90 days. So, I'm just going to go ahead and make this happen. Please understand, 90 days does not protect you. Just because an employee is within that 90-day probationary period, that it does not decrease your liability from a wrongful termination. What it is a period of time when maybe your employees are not eligible for particular benefits like paid sick leave. It's a period of more intense training, but really that's about it. Whether or not your employee is on day 1 or day 1001, the liability is still there. So make sure you're hiring and your hiring practices, your expectations, that you're setting your employees up to succeed. And if they're, manage that performance, document. If you don't document, it didn't happen. So make sure you're documenting all your disciplinary actions and your feedback and your coaching. There are essential policies, right to revise statement, paid sick leave, your equal opportunity, harassment and discrimination, leaves of absence, You've got to have your employee acknowledgements, your lactation accommodation. All of those policies are super essential and legally need to be in your manual. We recommend optional. Big one, personal device usage. We call it a personal device policy because everybody's got all these different ways of communicating on social media or whatnot. You've got watches, you've got iPads, you've got phones, you've got all these various devices. Make sure you've got a device policy. If you don't care if your employees are using them, that's fine. If you really do and you don't want them to use them during the workday, have that policy and make sure everybody is treated equal. If you have appearance expectations, if you have expectations that your employees don't wear heavy makeup, if they don't wear heavy fragrances, that they shower, if there are odors because of smoking, those types of things can be spelled out. Super, super awkward conversations, but your policies should really lay out those expectations. Termination policies and whatnot. Office property, what your employees able to do on office property or computer usage. I'm often questioned about what, I've got an employee that operates a side gig and she's using my computer to do her business. Yeah, the employees should understand there's no right to privacy on these devices and that, selling their supplements and things shouldn't be happening on the work, on the work computer, nor should they be happening to your patients or with your patients. They shouldn't be approaching your patients if they are selling, have some sort of side gig selling, nutritional supplements. It totally happens all the time. So, we don't need to really go through what it's not. It's just shouldn't be a procedural manual. It really should just be kind of the rules of the road for your business on how you expect your employees to behave and what is expected of you as their employer and what might happen if they're not following policies. Definitely have one. It's a living document. Review it at least once a year. Have an attorney review it. Keep it simple. Don't complicate your policies. Follow your policies. Train your managers to understand your policies. Many, many questions that I'm asked are answered in your own handbooks. So understand what your policies are, just like holidays, right? Just kind of go and look at your policy first. And then if you're confused, give me a buzz. Discipline and termination, performance and conduct, poor quality of work, theft, insubordination. Attendance and tardiness can be tricky if you've got, protections with employees who have disabilities, if there's CFRA intermittent leave, if an employee is struggling and there might be a leave of absence that they might be eligible for, then dig into that. But if it's truly just attendance issues and tardiness, then obviously you can discipline for that. When you're documenting, and again, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. Factually document any, the event, when and where it happened, any witnesses, what policy is violated. I'm a huge fan of falling back on policy. Quote the policy and how they violated it, what the consequences are in any prior incidents. I just recently developed a performance improvement plan. It's on the website. So document, here is what we expect. This is what, you're having trouble with, whether it's attendance, and that you want to see immediate and sustained improvement. I wouldn't add a date of improvement by, right? Because if you want to give an employee 30 days to improve and something happens and after 2 weeks, you're like, I'm done, that's it. You may be required to pay out that additional 2 weeks because you gave them time to improve and then you decided to withdraw that. So I would just say immediate and sustained improvement. Assure them privacy, identify the specific problem, identify the goals, schedule a follow-up meeting. How's it going? Do you need to course correct? What's going on? And then try and end it on a positive note. Kind of the logistics of termination. There are required notices. We do have a checklist. There is a unemployment notice that is owed to the employee. A HIP notice has to do with healthcare that is available to employees when they have been when they've lost their job. It's not necessarily related to notices, the COBRA notices. This is a HIP notice that's required. You have to provide a change in relationship notice, whether it's a simple change in relationship notice that we have on the website or some sort of documentation that you are separating the employee from employment. If there's outstanding dental treatment or loan balances, again, you cannot take any of this out of final pay, any money owed. I would get the employee, even with a written agreement, don't do it. Attorneys recommend that you don't do that at all. When termination is occurring, direct deposit ceases. Unless you can 100% guarantee that the money will be in the bank the day of termination, you can't direct deposit. You cannot mail a final check unless the employee gives you permission. Get written permission. Even a text message is okay. Keys, uniforms, office property, can't take any of that out of final pay. Can't withhold final pay in hopes of getting that back. So the no call, no show, employee abandonment, this is based on a matter of policy. There is no law about how long you need to hold a position for an employee when they no call, no show. It's based on policy, generally 2 to 3 days. An employer should show with some documentation that they attempted to reach out and find the employee, and give them an ultimatum. Like, I haven't heard from you. Our policy says you are to communicate when you are not in going to show up to the business. And then ultimately, if it does turn out that the employee isn't showing up, then it's a termination. Some traps here. Failure to investigate. What's going on? Why are you terminating? Have some documentation. Know why you're terminating. Sometimes saying too much, you can kind of, trip over your tongue and say too much, and I feel bad, and, really stick by your convictions. Just don't go into a long dissertation of why you've decided to separate. Maybe not seeing that sustained and immediate issues as discussed. Just, give them some reason why you've decided to let them go. In general, an employee shouldn't be surprised unless it's a business decision and you have eliminated a position. Let's hope that you've been managing the performance and they can see it coming, right? Like they just know. If you don't say enough, they're going to create a movie in their head. They're going to tell themselves the reasons why you terminated, that you're this terrible employer and they've been wronged. And then they're going to go and tell everybody else that they've been wronged. And, so say something so employees do understand why. Allowing departing employees to stay too long. This is a personal choice. Somebody gives 2 weeks. You have the ability to then turn a resignation into a termination if you don't want a toxic situation to occur with somebody who has given 2 weeks notice. You can absolutely terminate early. I've had questions about separation agreements. Template forms don't work. If you really want to provide some sort of severance or have an agreement where an employee won't sue you for termination or something, work with an employment law attorney to come up with that type of letter. You can require an employee provide you a non-disclosure agreement to reiterate your confidentiality. Ideally, your employee manual includes this, but it's kind of a good idea to make sure that an employee, it's reiterated that they shouldn't be taking any of your, they shouldn't be reaching out to any of your patients to lure them to another office or something. Lot of employers don't understand final pay requirements. If an employer terminates an employee, the final pay is due a live final pay is due on the employee's last day of work. So if they give 2 weeks notice, you need to make sure the check is in hand that day. Don't wait to process normal payroll. If an employee quits with less than 72 hours notice, final pay must be available at the employee's workplace within 72 hours. And that's 72 hours. That can include weekend hours. So if you get an email on Friday night at 5 o'clock that your employee is no longer returning, the clock starts ticking. So make sure that you are providing that final pay. And again, the employee can request that final pay be mailed. I'm going to Doctor, do you have a question?
Yeah, a real good one came up. Employee
Okay.
resigns within 2 weeks notice, and you decide to part ways less than 2 weeks to avoid toxic situation.
Yep.
This would not be considered you're laying them off. Is that correct?
No, a resignation then becomes a termination. So it flips. You've decided to end the relationship early. It's not a layoff. A layoff is a termination, but a layoff implies that if a position should become available at a later date, you would call that employee first. So don't make any loose promises by laying someone off, that if you should have this position available, that we'll be giving you a call first. So it's a termination at that point. Yeah. I'm going to kind of skip through personnel records a little bit. I'm just going to say that definitely have a personnel record policy. You should have 2 records: general employee file for basic information and a confidential employee file. One of the things that should be included is if you have employee identifiable COVID medical screenings that you've been doing over the last year, tracking temperatures, and it is identifiable to the employee, it should be in that confidential employee record. So termination records, medical insurance, things like that. Employees, they do have access to their records within 30 days of request. They don't have, access to relating to investigations, letters of reference, ratings reports, or records that were obtained from prior employers and whatnot. Let's skip through this a little bit. So let me talk a little bit about paid sick leave. We're getting close here. So right now, employers of less than 25 can voluntarily pay employees for paid sick leave for COVID-related reasons. If an employee prior to April 1st exhausted the 80 hours of COVID leave due to, who knows, exposure, quarantine, they were sick, things like that, that balance restarted on April 1st. This is voluntary. Okay, you don't have to pay this if you choose not to. If you do, this is available through September 30th as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. So it's the same reasons generally as the PHRca. So the 6 reasons, subject to federal quarantine, advised by a healthcare provider to quarantine, but they expanded the reasons to include if the employee is seeking or awaiting results of a COVID test, if they're obtaining immunization related to COVID-19, they're going for the vaccine, or an employee is recovering from an injury, disability, or illness related to the immunization. They didn't feel good for a couple days. You can voluntarily pay under PHRca or the ARPA and still get the benefits from IRS payroll tax deductions. So you can still get 100% of these wages back from the IRS through those payroll tax deductions. We do have a template on the website that an employee can fill out to provide you documentation that they were seeking the immunization or whatnot. Now, I don't know if there are many employers here on this webinar that have more than 25 employees. If so, keep in mind, California's supplemental paid sick leave is required. So if you have more than 25 employees, they can request retroactive leave through back to January 1st for those 80 hours. They are unable to work or telework due to a COVID-related reason. If they're subject to a government isolation or quarantine, it does not apply to employees who are prohibited from working due to the emergency temporary standards. So if somebody has COVID and they are kept out of the business, that's a workers' compensation issue. If they aren't covered by workers' comp because it wasn't a work-related injury, then that likely would be a disability that they can go after SDI benefits. The qualifying reasons for the leave under SB 95 are basically the same as I described: attending an appointment to receive the vaccine, they're sick from the vaccine, or they were experiencing symptoms of COVID, or they were taking care of a family member with COVID or whatnot, or a place of care is closed. You can't require an employee to use other unpaid leaves before this one. Using this leave, you've got to post and distribute a required notice. You also have to include the an itemization of the 80 hours that is available to the employees on their wage statement. I included how the leaves interact. If an employee is exhausted their paid sick leave under SB 95, and it applied to time in the first quarter of the year, you can choose to voluntarily provide additional leave to employees under the ARPA for the rest of the year. So they do kind of interact.